All right. So yeah, so we have our project coming up. Our project actually, I actually deployed it already. So it's actually visible here. So I'm going to show you guys how you can find that really quickly. I think I'm going to show you how to do that. There we go. Too many windows. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you guys can see what's up. And of course, Zoom moves my windows everywhere, so I can never find it. There you guys are. Okay, so if you go now into the curriculum, or sorry, in LearnCo, you can see that it'll pop down, and you can see now an end of module project. So if you click here and just open that in here, you'll see now there is a new README with description of the project itself. So a few things to know. I won't read this all completely through. I think you guys can do it. But basically, the main thing is talks about like what does this project entail. There is some extra what's it called, a data file that you have to deal with too. So it's actually in the GitHub repo itself. But basically, it's going through some processing like what you need. The main thing that I want to really point to you guys to make sure you guys have is something, these deliverables. And so these deliverables, basically, these are the parts that are required to pass the project. So let's hear, not next week, but the week after, we'll have project assessments, I guess the week after break. And so for your assessment to pass the project, you need to have all parts of these turned in ahead of time. So for example, the first one is your Jupyter notebook, which is basically going to be most of what you do, like most of your work. It's going to be all your technical stuff, all your code, your explanation. We'll talk about what those look like. And that should be in its own separate repo. So one thing I would suggest is maybe make this as a separate repo by itself. You could potentially make another repo, or you already have a repo of like just projects. My suggestion is that I would probably just make this as a separate repository on GitHub. That way it's like, this is just this project, and that kind of makes more sense. And that way too, if you do changes and stuff like that, maybe for example, you do this and you're like, oh wow, like I really enjoy doing this, and you really take off on it and you actually make something like could be deliverable to some other, like to show off, or basically like when you do an interview, you'd want to have just that one, say, oh, this is my one project. So this really should be its own separate repo. But anyway, the first part is your Jupyter notebook. So that's the stuff with all your code in it. The second part is going to actually be a README file. So we'll talk about this next week, especially like we'll have office hours to say, what's a good README, what is a readme.md. And basically it's a markdown file, but it's the first thing you see on GitHub. So if you open up like, for example, if I go onto a repository, you'll see it pops this up. If you have a README, which is this readme.md, it's the first thing that pops up here. So basically that README is going to be describing your project and saying what's going on in this. Basically a quick summary, so someone who finds your project, they can quickly read the README, hence README, and they can actually see what that project is supposed to be about and go from there. The next part is your Keynote, PowerPoint, Google Slides presentation, right? Note that it should be exported as a PDF. The reason why is because, as you can see, these are just 3 of the ways you can do a presentation. It really should be exported to PDF. That way other people can see it, and it's easy to kind of send it out. If you want to use something specific that's out of this and you can't export to PDF, just let me know ahead of time so we can kind of work this out a little bit. I think the only thing I can think of, like on top of my head, is someone if you did like a presentation, stuff like that. I know a few people who really like Prezi. I personally am not a huge fan of it. I think there's a little too much movement in my opinion. I don't know if anyone's familiar with Prezi or things like that. But I don't know exactly if you can export those to PDFs. But the important part is we have this PDF export, and this would also go inside your repo. So you would put this basically in your repo as your presentation.pdf. And that way, some other people coming across your project, they can also see your presentation, which is going to be an important part because this is going to basically show how well you can communicate, your concepts and findings. So you do want to actually have this as part there so someone can see it. The fourth part is your blog post. So this blog post is connected with your project. I can't actually, there used to be a description. I think we've changed it since then because I think for the better. But for the blog post, there's some link about how to talk about this. But one thing I suggest is connected to your project is really focus, instead of trying to, like what sometimes people do with their blog posts, they'll talk about a whole bunch of stuff about their project, and they'll say about the whole process. And I think honestly, that's not the best direction to go with this. If you're really set on it and you feel like, I got this writing style and I think I can really frame it in a good way, go for it. But my suggestion is to try to focus on one aspect, some technical aspect of your project. So this blog post should have things like images, right? So those images could be your visualizations that you have, code snippets. So if you're saying, like, oh, like if you say in the thing, I made a linear regression, or, oh, like we were cleaning this data file, you know, we removed the, you know, I don't know, like we removed, you know, these missing values. Have those code snippets, show that you know how to code, and show like what that looks like. A great examples are just going to like medium.com, a lot of those, and just search for data science articles, and just going through those, and you can kind of get a feel for like what that technically looks like. And you can think of your blog post as like you're talking to people who are at least familiar with data science. So that way, if building your online presence, it shows that you know data science. It shows that you're familiar with it, and you can communicate those things. Okay. This doesn't have to be super long. This is probably like, I think it's the one that, to be quite honest, people tend to neglect the most because it's kind of like the most outside of everything. But I would strongly encourage to make sure you think about, like, you know, okay, what do I really want to write about? You know, take some time. I know not all of us are the best writers, right? Some of us enjoy writing more than others, but something to kind of keep in mind. And one thing too, I think some people sometimes like will say, hey, like, I don't know if I really want to post this. Like, I'm kind of fearful to have other people see my work. You're welcome to, for example, to share it with each other. You're welcome to share it with me. You're welcome to share it, you know, obviously with your friends and family and stuff like that before you post it, just to kind of get it, feels like, you know, does this make sense? Or, you know, do you think I could do something different? All that stuff. I see something in the chat menu. Yeah, so is the blog post in addition to the first blog we post? Yes. So that first blog post, I think the total is 7 blog posts. And in those 7, 2 of them, one of them is that very first one. Another one is just another blog post. You can always write more. And those other 5, those each go with the project. So this will be your first project blog post. Thank you, Jeffrey, for asking that. So yeah, so those different parts, and then a video walkthrough. So before you freak out, like, oh, do a video walkthrough. This is basically your non-technical presentation. So you have your presentation all set. So you got your PDF, right? And then in our assessment, our one-on-one, we'll actually go over it together. And like, you'll basically present to me or whoever the instructor, if it's not me. This video walkthrough basically is just a recording of you doing that presentation. And I'll say recording of you, meaning like recording of the presentation with you talking over it. Someone asked me before, do I have to like dress up and like be like record myself? I'm like, no, you don't have to record yourself. like the important part is the presentation and you talking over it. But I mean, if you really want to, if it makes you feel cool, like you could do that. But the important part is like showing your presentation. And so the real reason why we do this, to be quite honest, is that it helps you practice. We are essentially forcing you to do a practice before you do the project assessment. And also, like, don't freak out. I mean, like, oh no, I made a mistake. Like, I like slipped up my speaking or something like that. You hear me like mess up my words all the time, constantly. You can kind of get a feel. I record like every session I have because I don't really mind that much. You shouldn't have to worry. One thing is that sometimes I've had people like, they try to redo it like 4 different times. I'm like, that's so tiring. Don't do that. Like, it's not there for, I mean, you can put it together and share it to other people, but it's really there for you to do a practice and for us to kind of have a record saying, okay, this is what the presentation looked like. One thing, so you can see some tools here, Zoom, QuickTime, Nimbus. There's a couple tools that I have used in the past that are really useful. I think one is called Screencastify, which is really useful if you have just Chrome. It's a Chrome extension, and you can just record directly in the browser. Or I don't even think you have to do it in the browser, but basically it can record your windows, and you don't have to have any special software and whatnot. This also, it has a free version, which is like, I think you can record up to 15 minutes, which your presentation will not be 15 minutes. So you should be pretty safe in that sense. There's another one too, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, and I think it was Loom, I think what it was. Loom? Yeah, this is another one that was, but this screen recording capture software, also an extension on your browser. So it's nice if you can have Chrome, essentially, you have a way to record your screen. I find the other ones sometimes be a little hard to deal with. But anyway, so those are those 5 different parts. And these should all be basically turned in before your actual assessment. Note that it's on the right here. So you'll see actually your GitHub repo, your blog post, and your walkthrough. So essentially you'll just paste the URL right here. And then of course, oh no, that's it. So you basically fill these parts in here. There we go. your GitHub repo, your blog post. So like you could post it to like medium.com. You can post it to your own personal website. We also have LearnCo's blog posting tools as well. You can do it for there. Basically, wherever your blog lives, this is where you'd want to post it into. And then your walkthrough, that's just, some people just upload to YouTube. You could potentially put it in like your repo if you really wanted to, and just make sure it's just the direct link. So we can like, when we click on that, we can find where the video is. Okay. See, I'm trying to think of anything. And your README, note that your README you don't put in here because it's going to be part of your repo. So you don't have to worry about that part. Okay. Cool. Any questions about these 5 parts that you have to have all set?
For the README, is there an example of what like a well-organized file looks like?
No, that's something, to be quite honest, I have to work on. This is actually a relatively new requirement that we're kind of putting in. I think it's a really good requirement because it's one of those things like, yeah, it's actually a pretty good idea. We should actually make sure people have that. It was kind of been implicit. Now we're making explicit thing. Oh, right, we really should have a README. So I think that's something that we'll talk about for office hours. So I'll put something together to show you guys a few example READMEs and what the expectations are.
Okay.
So cool.
And then also like how, I guess just to get an idea of like how many hours the project takes overall, like what do you see that people put in time?
Yeah, this is the fun one, right? It's like, cool, so how long is this project? So I will tell you is that there's a reason why we have project week just for project. Essentially expect that 40, 45 hours that we say for your basically learning for each week, that would be the whole week for the project. I would say that's pretty accurate.
Okay.
Okay, cool. Now it might be a little bit more. I'd say a little bit less, but don't count for less. Definitely like at least that 40 hours. And we'll talk about a little bit about what that what parts I would say to focus on. And I'll tell you right now, it's the cleaning. The cleaning is going to take you the longest amount of time. So yeah, good questions. Any other questions you guys may have? No? Okay, cool. And so just know there's some extra notes in here. I won't go through it. You guys can read, hopefully, right? So I think you guys can read this through. If you have questions, of course, ask and, you know, ask me any questions. This is actually wrong. This channel, you guys don't have access to this channel. So you can always ask questions in our cohort channel, or you can always ask questions in the different Slack channels for like these specific projects. So I think this project in particular, this channel is for, what's it called? Python, yeah. So it's module_python_ds. That's where most people ask their questions about this project, and you'll see other people who are in that same area. Okay, so that's kind of a quick intro of the actual project itself, like where you can find it. It's all up and ready for you. So I quickly have some advice. So next week is office hours. So like I mentioned before, next week is all like project week. There's no new curriculum. It's just the project. Our study groups are still the same time, but instead of having a study group for specific stuff, we'll have more office hours. A couple of those office hours, I might have specific things I want to go over and say like, these are some things that we can like talk about and want to give you some extra advice. But in general, they're basically there for you guys to come and ask questions. I suggest, even if you don't really have a question, still come to office hours, at least at the beginning, to see if other people have other questions that may be useful to you. I don't tend to record office hours because it doesn't really make sense in a lot of ways, because a lot of times it's just people asking questions and stuff like that, and I want you guys to feel comfortable in doing that. If there's a specific thing that I want to go over, I might record that session. But I would say if you miss study group / office hours, there probably won't be a recording of it. So that's kind of like my kind of warning to you guys. But yeah, so I do have some general advice here. And let me go ahead and just pull up. So cool. And we'll talk about it today. Sorry, I'm getting my windows together. All right, so here's my general advice for basically all of these projects, but especially because it's their first one. So I'll try to not bore you guys too much going through. So remember, there are different parts of your actual thing. So turning in your project, turning your project before one-on-one. The reason why is, like, first of all, it gives you a firm due date where you're not working on it until like 5 minutes before your actual assessment. You have some time to relax and everything. But also, It also helps me, like, if I can look at it ahead of time, I can catch things ahead of time and let you know, like, hey, you need to, like, can you change this part? Or, okay, it looks good, you know, or I can be more familiar with it before the assessment. Usually what I do is they're hour-long assessments. Really, the first 45 minutes is the actual part, about 5 minutes to present some questions for non-technical. It takes about 15 minutes in total, and then 30 minutes about like going over as a non-technical piece. But those last 15 minutes of the hour, I like to save so that way we can go over some feedback right away. So it's all fresh in our mind. We can just talk about it, like, you know, relatively informally. If there's something that catches my eye, immediately it's like, oh, you need to change this before I can make you pass. Or like, you know, I might say, oh, it looks good, but maybe in the future, or you can go back to this and change aspects or explore these parts or all that stuff. This is where I like to give you guys feedback immediately, since it's fresh in our mind. And then you can also leave that assessment not wondering, did I pass? Did I not pass? I don't know. Yet hopefully you'll have a pretty good idea. Okay, so turn in your stuff ahead of time. My suggestion is that Monday is like the project is due. It's really not due. It's like we start assessments. But I like to make it so if you guys can think of your project has to be turned in on that Monday, even if your assessment's like on Thursday or Friday even, at least then you know it's turned in. You don't have to think about it, because then we'll start doing new section material. So it's good just to have it turned in. So I'm going to keep saying this over and over again every office hour. It's like, all right, just remember, turn it in on Monday, right? You technically can turn in later, but I'm going to tell you, turn in Monday is going to help you so much. Okay. All right. So some advice for notebooks. So in your notebooks, first of all, keep it clean, right? Your narratives are good and conversations with a data-minded person. So that's the things to kind of keep in mind. So the first thing is basically keep your notebook nice and clean. I say use Markdown. So that's the stuff like kind of like these kind of cells versus code. Use Markdown to explain what you're achieving, what you're trying to achieve. In the code, use functions and like try not to repeat. If you find yourself doing the same code, like copy and pasting the same code over and over, that probably means that should be a function. But when you do make a function, make sure you document what that function is doing. Use comments, use a doc string, which are basically the first string underneath a function. If these are things you're not really sure about, we can go over them too. But basically you want to make it clear, so not just for other people to understand what you're doing, but also while you're doing it, if you come back on the next day and you're like, oh shoot, like I made this function, but I don't remember what it does, you can actually go back to that. So comments and doc strings are super important. Again, I'm someone, not everyone agrees with me, but I'm someone who says more comments, the better. If I see something with more comments, I'm fine. I can just ignore comments. But if I see something with no comments, I just know I'm in for a bad day because I won't know what's going to happen in there. And sometimes, you know, I'm perfectly fine, but there's other times I come across and I'm like, what is that? And I have to stare at it for a while, work it out. It's just not fun. So make things pretty. Like, honestly, not too many people are going to complain about saying too many comments. Most people will have a difficult time if you have no comments. So yeah, but your comments really should be explaining what your code's doing. So you don't have to say, for example, create a for loop. Like we kind of know, it's like, or like save the variable 3, or like, you know, let's say like x equals 3 and say like assign x to 3. It's like, that's not really that like important. The important part is like, you know, for example, if you're doing an iterate, like if you're going over and trying to find multiple features, you might put a comment on there, iterate through different features to find the best feature for this model. Like that could be a good comment that explains what the next bit of code it is. It doesn't have to be on every line. It really can just be about like the next few lines. But the important part is kind of saying like the high level of like what you're doing. Again, the markdown's explaining why you're doing it, saying, why are we doing it this way? Like, for example, if you notice that there's a lot of missing values, say, okay, let's explore, in the markdown, you might say, oh, let's explore for missing values and see if there's any issues in there. And your code might actually have underneath there looking for those missing values. Okay. One comment, I think I've talked to a few people already about this, but when I code, I use pseudo comments first, or pseudocode. I put comments. And this way I basically write out my like thought process of like, all right, do this, do this, do this, do this, all in comments, no code. And that way, what I do then is like, okay, I take that part and I just underneath each one, I start writing the code underneath it, doing that specific part. And at the very least then, when I'm done, if I write no other comments, I at least have those comments explaining each part and they're already there. I find that's a lot easier when you do something that's optional ahead of time versus doing it afterwards. Because when you're done with writing your code, you're not gonna wanna go back and like put all the comments individually and stuff. That takes more work. So you might as well do those ahead of time, which helps you organize, but also then when you're all done, you don't have to go back and do it yourself. So it's a little bit easier to organize everything. Okay. Overall, make sure your notebook is readable, that someone's not going to be like squinted, like what's going on. So make sure your variable names look good, your function names are good, comments and mark down those different cells between. Okay, any questions on that overall, keeping
Yeah,
your notebook clean? Yeah, go ahead.
can you have like multiple cells, or is all of your code supposed to be within like one cell block?
That's good. I personally would say break up your code cells by logical aspects. So it's like, okay, I'm doing this one thing. Let me make this one code cell. What I like to do is like if there's a new function or a set of functions, I'll put that all in one code cell because like, oh, these are all related together. And then I won't call the function within that cell. I'll make a new cell to call it. So yeah, but it's always style. You could technically put in one cell. I personally would suggest try to split them up more. It's easier to make it more modular. Okay, cool. All right. So last couple things about notebooks. Keep it a narrative. Remember, it's really like your reader should follow your thought process from top down. So one thing I say is like make your steps clear. So like that way someone can follow through. It doesn't have to be the exact way you approached it. So you might, when you're doing this project, you might be doing a lot of exploring, going back and forth a little bit. But in the end, you want a notebook that kind of reads like a nice like story, as if like, you know, you explored it. You ever like read those things where you're just like, how do they know how to do that? Like it seems kind of a big jump, like especially in math textbooks. That's because they did a whole bunch of stuff, but they're making a nice narrative saying like, well, this is how you kind of get to here if you already knew the path. That's perfectly fine. So keep that organized in there. And stop talking about like top down. One thing I like to do is I'll do a kernel, like right up here, I'll do a kernel restart and then clear output. And then I'll run each part all the way down through periodically. So I say about like every 30 minutes, maybe an hour at the most, is I'll stop myself like, okay, like, let me just double check and I'll just do a kernel restart, clear out output, and then just run each top to bottom. Because that way, if there was a, like, if I ran a couple cells back and forth, because you can run Python going like back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. You might have changed something that you might not have realized. But then so when you try to rerun it again for the first time, or again, clearing it from the very beginning, it might not work anymore. So this is a good catch to help you kind of make sure things run orderly and everything like that. Okay. So that's kind of related to like making that top down. All right. And the last part is that just know that your notebook is going to be more for a data-minded audience. You don't have to explain every little aspect of saying, oh, I am getting, you know, like this is, I'm trying to think of something good. Like we're making a new data frame. We're reading in a data frame. You don't need to talk about that stuff because you can assume that they understand this part. If there's something particular about the way you read it, like maybe you're skipping over lines, there's a certain reason why you're doing this, you can explain those parts. But you think of like the person you're talking to or presenting this notebook to is a data team member or a manager. They're familiar with data, they're familiar with data science, but they're not familiar with that specific data set. They're not familiar with this specific problem. So you'd want to basically, the first thing I'd say, like when we go through this like technical kind of presentation, it's more like a conversation. This technical conversation is you would say, okay, this is the data, this is what the data looks like, this is how many items there are, and so on, to give someone a feel for what the data is, or data are, and then you can go from there. Okay, cool. Any questions about a couple things I just talked about? Cool. All right, so that's your notebook overall. Your presentation. So I'm gonna put this up here. I think I mentioned this before. I had a high school teacher who, one of my classmates, like it was like a 12th grade, like advanced, like AP government class. So they're a little studious. And for some reason she asked our teacher, it's like, hey, like, you know, are we gonna do presentations, like oral presentations? And he said no. He was like, why not? And he said, I would rather roll in broken glass than watch you guys do presentations. And I thought it was hilarious. And I think it's kind of true. It's that a lot of times presentations are just gonna be really bad. And I'm not saying you guys will be bad, because you guys will be amazing. But I think sometimes it's really easy to end up making a really good presentation and doing too much to it to make it, you know, not the best or not clear or a little bit harder to understand. So here's some general tips. So one, it really should be 5 minutes. It should be about 5 minutes. You're not gonna hit it exactly, right? But definitely more than three. If you go under 3, that's definitely way too short. You need to take more time. But at the same time, taking more than 8 minutes, you're probably going a little too deep into stuff. You're maybe going a little bit off track, it should be about 5 minutes. 10 minutes is really the maximum. I don't think I've ever actually cut anyone off like at a certain point. Maybe because I'm just too nice. I'm just like, oh, this is interesting, but I'm like, oh, it's getting kind of late. So just kind of be aware of this. And this is where that video presentation will help you with. But basically be aware of your time. And that's true for any presentation. If someone says, hey, we want you to come in for 10 minutes, don't go in for 30. You need to make sure you try to stay as best you can to whatever is expected. Overall, you are the subject of your presentation, not the slides. The slides are great. The slides have great information, but if I can just remove you from the presentation and just look at the slide, present. So remember that you are really the presenter, like you are the presenter. You are the subject of the presentation. The slides only emphasize your points. So basically is that most of the information, like the detail, should be coming from you. It shouldn't be directly on their slide. If it's an important detail that you feel like they should actually like take that and remember that, and they should be able to walk out without writing it down, they should see that and they should remember it, then you can keep that on the slide. But if it's something that should be like, it's like, oh, it would be like an extra note to write down, then maybe that's something you should verbally tell them versus like actually putting on a slide, or at least separating it out a little bit so there's not an overload amount of information. Because remember, you have a lot of data you're explaining. So you want to make sure that you're not going too far into detail and stuff. Okay. Yes. So again, this kind of goes with less is more. So this kind of goes with like, don't giving too much, like going on and on about all this extra information. Everyone sees like the wall of text, you know, from presentations, right? Everyone says, oh, everyone sees that wall of text and you're like, nah, let's not do that, right? The same thing happens with visualizations. You don't want your visualizations to have huge amounts of information. You want your visualizations to be clean and understandable at a relatively quick glance. Like someone should be able to look at it and like look away and say, what did that graph mean? It's like, oh, I saw that there were some bars that were higher than others, and I could see that there were some emphasis points. If I have to stare at the graph and really squint and say, what is this saying? And tilt my head a little bit and kind of like have to think about it a little bit, that might be too much information for a presentation, in my opinion. So just kind of be aware of that. Yeah, and we'll talk more about this. And this is where you guys are free, for example, to like share me your drafts and share drafts with each other. It doesn't have to be done in a vacuum. You guys are welcome to like share that and get some advice and stuff. Because sometimes we're too close to our own work and we kind of forget like, oh, maybe there's a little too much in here because you were excited about it, which happens. All right, so here's my little like general like advice. I don't know, it's not that amazing, but like, anyway, I think in general is like, you can break these rules. Like, these are my personal preferences. Don't like feel like, oh, if I do this, if I do one of these things, I'll like fail, or Victor's not gonna like my presentation. No, these are just general rules because I think it's easier to restrict yourself early on versus taking something and then trying to change it up and like remove parts and stuff and to make it cleaner. So overall, basically, each slide is a single thought, no more than 3 bullets per slide, only use sentence fragments, visuals, and pictures, okay? If you just have those general parts, I think your presentation would be likely, it's harder to make a bad presentation if you follow those things. You can also break some of these rules and have a perfectly great presentation, but I think you can go into a little too deep. So each slide contains its own thought and process. More slides are fine. I think sometimes people get afraid, like, oh, I should only have like 6 slides in my presentation. Otherwise, people will think, you know, I'm going through much. There'll be too much. I sometimes have like something like 12 to like 20 slides in like a 5-minute presentation, which might seem kind of like, it's like, oh, that's a lot. But a lot of times those single slides have like a single like picture or a single like word phrase, where it's like, if I show them like 3 words, like I don't have to spend a whole minute looking at those 3 words. I can say 3 words over there and move on to the next slide, and people are perfectly fine with that. So more slides are fine. One thing you can do is use the slides to introduce topics or summarize what you're saying. That's a really great way to like form it. It basically preps everyone to say, oh, okay, I can see that this is now is what we're talking about next, or like, oh, that's what we talked about. Cool, move on to the next part. Remember, your slides are emphasizing your points, not all the information itself. So remember, you're giving all that detail. If you ever at some point have to turn and like literally read your slide, obviously you're not going to turn because you're in a computer, but like if you ever have to like read directly from your slide, it probably means you have too much information on it. So try to keep it as one solid concept. So one thing is make sure you do recommendations for the business. So 3 recommendations. make each slide a separate recommendation, like, or at least each recommendation on a separate slide. So that way it's like, this is a single thought, thought concept. You want to present just that. So that way it emphasizes, oh, this is an important thing by itself. Okay. Any questions on this so far? Cool. All right. So no more than 3 bullets per slide. Again, this is my personal preference. I think when you have too many bullet points, it can just be a little too much for people. And that what usually happens is, if you ever see people like suddenly, like when you pull up a slide, and you've probably been this way too, you see a slide and you see a bunch of information, you instantly start writing. If you see like your people, like when you present it, and like they're instantly start writing down the information, try to kick notes furiously, just like you guys did when I pulled up that whole thing, it means that they're no longer listening to you. They're now pulling all that information because like they don't know when it's going to go away, and they want to make sure they get through that as quickly as possible before you talk. So limiting it to like 3 bullet slides or bullet points is probably a good idea. If there's more than that, like even 3 can be split up more. But if you have like 4 or 5 bullet points, maybe split them up into different parts. Maybe condense them into one concept or multiple parts. Remember, you can go through slides as quick as you want, as long as that information's really easily digestible. Okay. Yeah. Only use sentence practice, and this is my preference, is it's just easier to read. You don't have to like have this full sentence. I don't use periods in like presentations usually, because it's just like, unless it's a formal definition or it's a quote or something like that. Generally, when your sentences tend to grow longer and longer and longer, you're being more specific, which is great. But remember, if you're going to be more specific, usually that's you talking about it, not the slides or whatever talking about it. Okay. This is kind of like why I also do things like this. I don't put my full sentence on here so I can talk about it and say each individual point. Okay. All right. Any questions on this guy? Pretty good so far. Cool. Again, remember, these are just all my opinions, right? So last one's visuals. Just like too many words, make sure they're not too complicated. So if you have a lot of information in your visual, it can be kind of jarring and also really confusing, and people are trying to stare at it and listen to you, and they'll probably just end up staring at it for a long time. If you ever have a visual, like, so if you have a visualization of like, you know, a bar graph, a box plot or whatever, don't put on the thing and then just move on or use words. Like, talk about it, walk someone through, say like, oh, this is the important part, or say, oh, these are the things that actually matter. This is part of that communication part where, remember, you are the subject of the presentation, not your slides. So if you show a visualization, you better talk about it, right? One other thing is that be careful about pictures with high density information. So one that I guarantee that if I don't say it now, someone would do it. Not that it's a bad thing, but someone will do a printout, or will take a screenshot of their report from OLS of like the linear regression line, and will put that on their slide. You will even see that like in every conference all the time, and people will put that in there. And it's too much information. There's no reason to have all that. You should condense it down and say, what are the important aspects? If you want to report that, you know, specific equation, then you make that a single slide and you just let people write that down if it's that important. If it's not, you likely can take parts of it and report. And here, you're talking to a non-technical audience, so you don't want to just put a bunch of information on there. You want to say, here's what's important. And they don't ever have to know what that readout was or what the equation for the linear regression line. That's not important to them. If they really want to know, they can ask you for it. Okay. One thing too is, I didn't put it on here, but kind of similar to high density information. GIFs and GIFs are really fun. Like, they're all awesome. However, they're really distracting the presentation. I don't know about you guys, but like, if there's ever like a GIF and it's the same repeating action for like every 2 seconds, I would stare at that all day. Like, I could not like not look at that. So just kind of be aware, it can make your presentation look kind of fun, but also just kind of be aware it's that like you're gonna probably distract some people. So if you do have something like that, again, maybe make a new slide, look at it for like 3 seconds, talk over it, and then move on to the next part. So just be aware of those things. Cool. All right, any questions, any kind of like things you guys want to add on about this presentations in general? Okay. And just remember, these are kind of like just my opinions. Like, obviously you can break these rules. Like, there's no reason like you have to follow these strictly. Okay, cool. All right, and then I'll go through these last 2 parts really quickly. Is that our video, just make sure you have practice. That's really what that video is for. It also helps us like record, like, okay, like what the presentation looked like, so reference and stuff like that. But the main things, don't stress. I would say at most, like if you record it once, and you're like, oh, that was really long. I need to practice it some, and then do another recording. But if you do more than 2 recordings, like if you're like recording it over and over and over again, I've been there, trust me, where I'm just like, I'm super like nervous, like, oh no, like this is like going to be staying there. Don't worry about it. It's just mostly for practice. Okay. And the last part is your blog. Like I had said, focus on some aspect of your project. It should be technical. It doesn't have to be super, you don't have to like try to show off to say like, oh, I know all this stuff, but it should have technical aspects. You should be showing your code snippets, visualizations. If you say something like, oh, I did this to make this visualization, show a code snippet of how you made that visualization or whatever you're doing. And that way someone can see what you did. Don't just like say it on your blog. Okay, cool. All right, and that's kind of it. Any questions about general advice on here?
I guess, do you have like a recommendation for order of how to do these things? So like, well, I guess Jupyter code, like I was thinking maybe Jupyter code, PowerPoint presentation, video, blog.
Yeah, that's about right.
Okay.
Like obviously you can't do anything without, like you said, without that notebook. That's going to be first step. And then from there, probably presentation to make sense. Maybe video right after your presentation. You could probably do the blog between presentation and video, or even after your notebook. But I think the presentation helps you get in, like, it's a little easier to do, like at least in my opinion. And then the blog part is kind of like, okay, you have to like kind of think about how you write all your sentences. But yeah, that's kind of, you nailed it. So.
And the video should be around like that 5 to 8 minutes.
Exactly. And it should be basically your video will be the same thing as your actual presentation, your non-technical presentation.
Cool. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. And if you record it and never watch the video, that's perfectly fine, as long as it's actually there. Don't feel like you're like, oh no, I have to like critique myself. And if I said the instead of a at one point, you know, it's not going to be a big deal. Okay. Cool. All right. Oh, last thing then, I should have mentioned this, is that there is a, on the Learn Co homepage, scrolling at the bottom, I think some of you guys have already seen this, is the Mod1 rubric. So I'll tell you guys is that the Mod1 rubric here, it might be updated later on, but I think for our group, it won't be updated. I think we're kind of like set in stone, bless you. So one thing to kind of consider, basically the way it's graded in the sense that like, did you pass the project, is essentially you have to have everything at least accomplished. So if you basically meet all the requirements down this column, you more or less basically pass the project. I'm trying to think if there's any situations where like I wouldn't pass you, but you did mark all of these. I don't think so. So use this as your guide of what you should need, what you should have and everything like that. There's also extra parts like the X factor kind of thing, other things you can do. These are more, you're not going to get like a better grade, right? Like there's no like A, B's, it's just a pass or, you know, no pass. But this might be something like if you really like this project or if you want to do some extra stuff, these are things that you can do. There's also other unique ways you can kind of approach the problem as well. But my thing is make sure you finish these accomplished parts before trying to like see, you're like, oh cool, like I need to do this part, but I really want to do this X factor aspect. Make sure you get these accomplished parts first so you don't spend all your time on this extra stuff and not able to focus on the rest of it. Okay, cool. All right, and with that then I'll go ahead and stop recording unless you guys have any other questions.